Train is leaving the station. All right, what do I have to do? I have to continue. There we go. The train is leaving the station, as they say. All right, well, hello, welcome everybody. Good to see you today. I'm Dan Yeager. I'm the Executive Director of NEMA, and this is a terrific workshop. This is a long one today, and it has the feeling of like a lot of content and a lot that's going to be covered. So very grateful for you being here. Before we get started, I would like to, there we go. I would like to acknowledge the places in which we gather. In this era of virtual meetings, when digital spaces may substitute our physical sense of place, it's important to reflect on the land we each occupy and honor the indigenous people who have called it home. I'm currently speaking to you from Swampscott, Massachusetts, the native homelands of the Massachusetts peoples. Wherever we are, let us acknowledge all indigenous nations as living communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We, the NEMA staff, recognize that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society that perpetuated the exclusions and erasures of many native peoples throughout the United States and beyond. We ask you to reflect on the place where you reside and work and respect the diversity of cultures and experiences that form the richness of our world and our profession. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let's see, Heather, do you want to go around the room first, or should I introduce our speakers? Maybe around the room first.
I think leave it up to Tim and Richard to see
what do you guys want to do. You want to get to know everybody first, then have me kick it over to you? All right, why don't we do this? So we're going to do a little bit of a popcorn here, which is a new phrase to me anyway, since the pandemic started. And we will start out intros. Why don't we start out with the NEMA staff, just to go there, and then Heather, why don't you start out and kick it over to Meg, and then go around the room.
Okay, I'm Heather Riggs. I'm Director of Administration here at NEMA. Most of you have seen me in the last year, so welcome. Meg.
Morning, everybody. I'm Meg Winnicates, Director of Engagement for NEMA. Lovely to see you all this morning.
Thank you, Meg. So, who to, Meg? Pass the baton. I guess that's not popcorn.
Okay, Carol Parker.
I always seem to get to be first. I'm Carol Parker. I do strategy consulting for museums and other nonprofits.
If you could say where you're based.
I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts.
Okay, great.
Why don't you pick somebody, Carol? And,
Richard's one of our speakers. Gail.
Two Gails.
There's two Gails.
Oh, Gail.
I jumped in. Gail with the Y.
Okay. There you are.
There we are. Hi, Carrie. Been seeing you for ever. I'm Gail Gifford. I'm a consultant from Providence, Rhode Island. I work with many organizations. I also teach management of cultural institutions in the Masters in Public Humanities program at Brown. And let's see, other Gail.
I don't think I've ever been in a workshop with two Gails before, so this is fun. I am Gail Nessel Cole Glazier. I'm in Londonderry, New Hampshire, which is the homeland of the Abenaki people. And I am a consultant as well. I do executive searches for museums and career consulting. And I am also on the board of our local historical society, so I'm wearing that hat today as well.
And you are handing it off to?
I am handing it off to, let me see, I forgot the last half of my duty, Carrie Taylor.
Good morning, I'm Carrie Taylor. I'm the director of Lippitt House Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, and I will be happy to pass it off to a former colleague from the great Commonwealth of Virginia, Tracy.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Appreciate that. Hold on just a minute, because I've got I've got a phone on to get the sound. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Great. I don't have really good volume on my computer, so I have to have my cell phone on to get the volume. So I'm Tracy Gillespie. I am the Southerner here. I'm in Virginia in Loudoun County. I am a site manager for 5 historic sites for an organization called Nova Parks. My home base, if you will, is in the little village of Aldie, Virginia, at Aldie Mill. I know of NEMA because my sister-in-law, Jane Gordon, introduced me to NEMA. She was in Concord, Massachusetts for many, many years at several historic sites and brought me once to a NEMA conference, which I really enjoyed. And so I decided this past year that I was going to join and take part in a lot of your wonderful webinars. So thank you for welcoming a Virginian amongst all of you New Englanders.
Excellent.
And so I need to pass this along to Nikki Stewart.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Stewart. I'm the Executive Director of Old North Church and Historic Site in Boston on the Freedom Trail. And I will pass it to my colleague, Catherine.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Matthews. I'm the Director of Education at Old North, and I am delighted to pass this off to Meredith.
Hi, I'm Meredith from a small town in north central Massachusetts, and it's just a little town, Shirley Historical Society, all volunteer, everything but busy. Oh,
Little town with a big heart.
you are right. Who have we? Betsy. Has Betsy had a turn?
Nope.
Nope. I'm Betsy Sugamelli from Canton, Massachusetts. We are starting a brand new museum, which we hoping to open in 3 years. It's the Paul Revere and Son Heritage Trust, and it will be probably the Revere Discovery Center. So we are in the process of having a master plan done, and they will assist us in writing a mission statement. So that is why I am here today. And I just want to say I've done a lot of webinars from a lot of places, and I want to say NEMA's have really, really helped me with practical things that I can act upon as soon as I've finished. So I want to thank you as well.
We like hearing that.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, who are we going? Shall I direct traffic here from here on in? Maybe I'll direct traffic. That'll be easier. Shaylin, how are you?
Good morning. My name is Shaylin Ameo, and I work on exhibits and interpretation at Connecticut Landmarks. We are a statewide network of historic house museums, and we have a couple that we're actually we're developing to open now. So very excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Suanna, where are you?
Right here. Hi, everybody. Suanna Crowley. I am trustee of the Robbins Museum of Archaeology down in Middleborough, Massachusetts, but I am based as a museum consultant up in Medford. I do go by the nickname Dr. Dirt since my first name is a little bit funny, but I am a Virginia transplant, so that's where that funny name comes from. So it's nice to see everyone.
There you go. Awesome. Good to see you again. Let's see, Lori.
Hi, I'm Lori Benson. I am one of the vice presidents for Maine's First Ship in Bath, Maine, and we are on the homeland of the Wabanaki, the people of the dawn.
Excellent. Good to have you with us. Let's see, John Hart. Okay, 5. Oh, there we are.
I'm here.
Hey, John.
I am going to keep my webcam off, though. I had my second COVID vaccine yesterday, and I look like I got run over.
You and Meg too.
So my name's John Hart. I'm the director of the Sullivan Museum and History Center, which is located at Norwich University in central Vermont, in Northfield. I'm actually home today in Randolph. So I'm here representing that museum where I'm director. But I'm also doing some consulting as of late with the Citadel Museum in South Carolina. The Citadel is another senior military college like Norwich, and they're trying to get their museum back up off the ground. And since I'm apparently the youngest military college museum director in the country, everybody keeps calling me.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wearing 2 hats today.
All right. Good. Well, hang in there, John. Glad you could be here. Maria.
Hello, folks. My name is Maria Quintero, and I'm the Outreach and Programs Manager at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And we, as everyone in Massachusetts, are sorting out our rollout to reopening. So I'm really excited to be here with you all and get a chance to really take advantage of this disruption that we've had for the last year to make new inroads with, especially with more directly prioritizing serving diverse communities.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Samuel. Hey.
Hi, my name is Samuel Sadowski. I am in development at the New Art Center in Newtonville, Massachusetts, and am relatively new here, still have been here about 6 months. Would like a better idea of how to sell to the community the fact how vital we are and how vital the arts are in the community. So,
Excellent. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
And now, I think last but not least, Jill and Jessica. I don't know if we have two people there or if it's one person with an alias.
Yeah, yes, it's two of us. I'm Jill Conley. I'm the manager of collections and interpretation at the Roach Jones Duff House and Garden Museum down in New Bedford. And Jessica? I'm Jessica.
Can't hear you, Jessica.
I plan all of our fundraising events. So yeah.
All right. All right. Cool. All right. Thank you. Now, did I get everybody? Anybody left behind here? No person left behind. All right, cool. That's great. So I'm going to introduce our speakers and then we will take it away. So again, thank you everybody for being here. Very grateful, especially for our speakers. Richard Josey, President and Principal Consultant, Collective Journeys, LLC, began studying and interpreting African and African American history in 1985 at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. In 2001, he became a manager of interpretive programs and soon after supervised staff and developed programs that explored the intersectionality of class, race, and gender. In 2012, he became the manager of programs at the Minnesota Historical Society. And as manager of programs, he directed the development of interpretive programs and provided administrative supervision and policy support for the Society's network of 26 historic sites and museums. Now, Josey is the president and principal consultant for Collective Journeys, LLC, a two-person consultation service with a mission to inspire compassionate communities by connecting history practitioners to solutions and strategies to presenting inclusive historic narratives. So thank you, Richard. Really grateful for you being here. And FYI, I love the Minnesota Historical Society. It's a great place. Tim Grove. Tim Grove is an author, historian, and educator, striving to find creative ways to engage diverse audiences with history and to demonstrate relevance to the past. He draws his experiences working as a public historian for over 25 years, including places such as the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, Smithsonian National Museum of American History, Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, the Missouri Historical Society, and Colonial Williamsburg Foundation in Virginia. During the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial 2004-06, Tim helped develop the national exhibition, which traveled the country. And he's listed among the history field's quote unquote most engaging, innovative, and entrepreneurial leaders, and profiled in the book Leadership Matters, which came out in 2014. And Tim, I met a few years ago with I think it was the launch of the History Relevance campaign. I remember being at AASLH, I think, and meeting you there and talking amongst a whole bunch of folks that were involved at the time with that. So with that, we've got two experts here on the job for us, and I'm going to turn it over to y'all to go over what the program is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Let's get the PowerPoint out, Richard. I'm thrilled to be back. I think last year it was around this time, I did about an hour-long session with Ken Torino for NEMA about relevance, and a few people wanted a deeper dive, and that's kind of what this is today. So I've been writing and speaking and thinking about relevance for a number of years now, that term relevance, and it's I would say as we will find out, it's a challenging term to try to define because it means different things to different people. But I hope that you will get a better grasp of how you approach relevance after this session. And we really hope that to give you applicable tips and tools to take with you to think more about how to be valuable to your different communities that you serve. Next slide. So these are some of the goals and outcomes we have today. Like I said, we hope that you'll be able to articulate what relevance means to you, and then why history is relevant. I know we have several people from other discipline areas. I think relevance obviously is something that every discipline area strives for, and there's a lot of connectedness. And so I think most of what we talk about today, even though it's focused on history, will relate to and be applicable to other disciplines as well. We really want you to leave fired up about making your site or your institution more relevant. And we want you to leave, like I said, with concrete ideas that you can take with you. And also know where to find examples of excellence. Who in the field is making a difference and finding ways to be very relevant. And then the ultimate is we all need to foster a mindset of relevance. Next slide. This is briefly a lay of how the 4 hours is structured. And I should point out that we hope this is participatory and we want to involve everyone. We have some small group activities planned. We'll see how that works. Usually works okay on Zoom. We'll go into different rooms and give us a chance to discuss with each other. So there are three main areas of relevance, which Richard will talk about in a minute, but the first sphere is the discipline of history. How is history relevant? If you can't make that case and you're a history organization, then you have a problem. And then the second sphere is we need to be relevant to our communities. And what does that look like? We'll talk about that. And the third sphere is really the personal. You have to try to be relevant to each individual that uses your products, if you want to call them that, whether they come visit your site or your website or a book that you published. How do you try to be relevant to the individual? So the discipline, the relevance of the discipline, the relevance to the community, and then the relevance to the individual. And then we'll put it all together. Hopefully we'll have enough time at the end to do a small group discussion. So that's kind of what it looks like. I'll kick it over to Richard now.
So good morning. Good to see everybody. This idea of relevancy is very interesting, and this is one of the reasons why, for me, it was very, how do you say, important when I joined the History Relevance campaign to sort of, let me deal with these subtitles 1 second. Sorry. Okay. Because, relevance looks different to every single person. And what we want to do is start thinking about relevance through some contemporary lenses, individuals that we may see or know about or hear about today. So we got a few images, and we just want to think about this guy right here for one. First one. Is he relevant or not? Any thoughts? Maybe he is. Maybe he is. I see Tracy.
He is.
He is. Why?
He makes a difference not just on the basketball court, but in our society. He speaks out for important issues.
Okay. Okay. Anybody else? Just another quick one.
Yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
This is Meredith. So I think you need to define the word relevant.
We are going to do that.
So before we even begin to dig into relevance, one of the things that we want to point out is that, Meredith, what relevance may mean to you may be different than what it means to Tracy. And as we go through these, what I want you to consider and contemplate a little bit is, before we define relevance, even at a whole level, what is relevant to you? Is this guy relevant to you?
Maria here. So I'll share, yes, in my household he is, and I'll share that for my spouse, he's a big NBA guy. So for him, he's incredibly relevant. He's broken records. He's made all these things. I'll say I don't follow basketball, but I'm incredibly aware of him in the realm of social justice and speaking up, and you know, a lot of his community work, specifically for Black and underserved communities. So he's very relevant for me and my husband in very different ways.
Okay, well, thank you. And I also want to note before I go to the next slide, because I want Tim to jump in on this too, is that it's I want to be clear that for some people, this guy may not be relevant at all. And I want us to be comfortable in, at least in this introductory stage of kind of thinking about relevance and thinking about, you know, celebrities and people that we see and whatnot, that the level of relevance right now when we think about these people is at a very individual level, and that's okay. I want you to also to consider that when people come to your historic sites, whether the history that you tell or whatever it is that you know that you have to offer, that relevance may be different for every single person who's thinking about coming there. And so this is the trajectory that we're on right now when we're thinking about relevance. So Meredith started laughing.
Unfortunately, we can't see everyone's hands raised, but I would say, you know, are these people relevant or not? And it could be to you, relevant to you, or relevant to society in general. We're not really defining that either.
Right.
Sort of relevant to the over 60s crowd, I think sometimes.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Betsy, because as an avid hip hop fan that I am, I find it very interesting, and I also make music, and so I find it very interesting that, you know, like the Stones or the Beatles or, you know, any of those groups that might appeal to, you know, the older audience, that sometimes when that music is recirculated within society, it makes them relevant again. Otis Redding is one that comes to mind, and so no, that's a very good point. How about her? She relevant or no? I see some head nods. What do you think there? They relevant to you?
Someone might be saying, "Who is that?" That's fine. You might not know everyone.
Who are they?
Are you targeting markets here? I mean, I don't.
This is Nirvana, and it's Kurt Cobain.
Oh,
okay.
My generation, very much so.
All these people had a, sorry, this is Sam. I think all these people had an impact on society. Is Nirvana relevant to what I'm trying to do here at the New Art Center? Probably not. I can borrow from their celebrity, but I don't know how it's necessarily relevant to what I'm doing right now. Do I like their music? Sure, I guess. It's, you know.
Well, and just to kind of unpack that a little bit, you know, this idea of relevancy as we talk, one thing we might want to consider, and that I've been considering this a lot, is, you know, I find you know, a lot of things in my life, you know, relevant to me that may not necessarily be a one-to-one application in the work that I do. But the flip side of it in this last year, if this last year has shown me anything, is how important the connection is between my personal and my work. Like self-care for me, I don't listen to Nirvana. I might hit the Stones every now and then. Maybe I like the Beatles too. They have nothing to do with the museum work that I do, but they have everything to do with the level of self-care that I need in order to make the museum work, you know, happen. So there is this sort of connection in the self-care and the us and the relevancy and how that applies for us to be able to do the work that we do. just something to consider, especially in the present moment that we're in, where self-care is a really big conversation point for us in this level of work. About him. For some, he may be relevant. For some, maybe not.
Jackie Robinson.
Oh yeah, Jackie Robinson. Thanks. How about her? Y'all know who she is, right? What do you think about Ellen? Ellen relevant to you? See some head nods.
Oh, yeah, I'm on. All these people and groups are relevant to our national history, our national sense of community, the directions we're going in. Whether or not I'm working on a program at my little museum, would I ever mention Ellen or any of those other people? Probably not. But as far as the national, the direction our country's going in has all been affected by just about every one of these people. So if that's what you mean by relevant, sure.
Okay. Let me clip through a few more of these folks. I see Meredith nodding her head. She know about Elvis. She know about Elvis. Let me see some of these other faces. Yeah, I see a couple of other head nods. Some of y'all see some smiles.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oprah, yeah. See some head nods. Some smiles.
Who is this?
Charlton Heston?
Yeah. Good job.
Thought it was Moses. What?
It is.
Not the hat he wears, right?
How about
yes?
Yeah. Relevant, I heard yes. I see some head nods.
So
absolutely.
Maybe I'm interpreting all your questions more instead of are they relevant, are they influential as who they are, what they said, what they did, having an influence on our nation. And yes.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Just the one thing that I would add in is I've always tried to be mindful to think about relevance in two ways. One is for me, because what's relevant to me might not be relevant to Betsy. And then in another vein, I think about relevancy in terms of my perception of someone's impact on the larger society. And so the way in which Colin Kaepernick is relevant to me is sometimes a little different than the way that I see him relevant to the larger society. And in many ways, that's okay at a foundational level of understanding relevance. And as a museum professional, once I understand that, then I start, it helps me transition to think about, okay, is this text on this panel or is this program that we're presenting, it might prompt the relevance within me, but not be relevant to other people. Right? Or it might be relevant to other people and not to me, which I'm more comfortable with it in that vein, especially if I'm in service to people. But yeah, I like to suggest how we look at relevance in those two strands at least, because some of these folks may be relevant to the wider population, but not to me. I don't swim, for example.
This is Michael Phelps.
Do you know he struggled with mental illness? So he might speak to some people in a certain way.
And good point, because that's how he is relevant to me, is through that mental health strain, but not through the swimming strain. And so that's another level in which how we find somebody relevant is through the multiple ways in which how they're identified. He's not just a swimmer, he's also an advocate for mental health, and so that's a very interesting point. I hadn't thought about that until you just said it.
So his relevance has changed through the years.
Yes. That's a really cool point.
So we like to start with this activity just to get people thinking about what relevance is. And now we're going to try to define it a little better. But I think you can see that relevance is highly personal. If you're not if you don't watch sports or a specific sport, you might not care about some of the athletes that we pictured. If you don't listen to their music, you might not care at all about the people. And it also, some of them have platforms that they use to talk about bigger issues in society. Some don't. All of that relates to if they're relevant or not. Relevance changes over time. Some of you know Elvis. Some younger people don't know Elvis. You didn't know Nirvana. Charlton Heston, you might not know who he is because he's not alive anymore. At the time, though, he had influence. He certainly was involved in the NRA, and so he was a big name at the time. So relevance changes over time. And it's not necessarily positive or negative. Whether or not you had a negative reaction to one of these people does not matter if they're relevant. They can still be relevant to society and have a negative kind of image or a positive image. I don't think that really matters that much. Do you have anything to add, Richard?
No, I think it's spot on.
Anything else anyone noticed going through this? I know some people were frustrated that we weren't defining relevance, and I'll say this over and over again in our time together. It's hard to define. It's very hard to define. Is it whether someone's influential? Is it whether they're popular? It's not about popularity, I would say. Are they connected to national conversations that are happening? That's one question to ask.
I guess what I would add is the visibility of their relevance. Like there were definitely photos that I didn't recognize until the name was put to them, as opposed to the others that right away I was like, oh, this is who they are. So which I think to museums is so important. Not just, how are we covering this, but how is it in the forefront? Specifically that image of Kurt Cobain, I've seen him a lot, and I didn't recognize him. I was like, oh, that is Nirvana, but that's not the image I see very often of them. They weren't in grunge, they weren't, I didn't make the connections till the name was there, even though definitely, Nirvana is something I can name drop. So yeah.
Okay.
I think there's an emotional component too, to build off what Maria is saying about, where I agree, when you're thinking about your visitors, there's the emotional component as well, including the sort of gee, I'm embarrassed I didn't recognize that person, or gee, I hate not knowing things and I'm frustrated, or I feel like thinking about scaffolding and kind of the sort of lost and confused, am I supposed to know this person? All of those, I think, are also a real part of the experience when you're trying to convey why someone is or should be relevant, if people don't know already.
And I think our visitors have the same feelings, is just probably what you're saying. Should I know about this important event in history? Gail, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say that regarding positive or negative, the same person can be relevant to everybody, but in a very positive way to some, as in Donald Trump, in a very negative way to others. And the same for history. George Washington, the founder of our country, versus George Washington, a slave who owned and enslaved people. It's all relevant, but very differently perceived.
It's a good point.
That's a really good point. And I was actually going to accentuate that, because I think a lot of times, as someone was saying earlier, in terms of popularity, oftentimes we think of, relevancy, how relevant you are in many ways depends on how many people know of you or have heard your name or anything of that nature. But then we also at times, and I've noticed the relevancy of someone or an issue or anything of that nature sometimes depends on how someone perceives whether it's positive or negative. So this is one of the challenges that I've noticed is that for many people, someone being relevant is a positive. And that's one of the things that I think we should just, be conscious and mindful of is that relevancy isn't necessarily a positive or a negative. It's just the impact or the level that it attaches or associates with, where we are at any present time.
We should probably go to the next slide.
Yes. And I kind of hide these subtitles because they're weird.
So I want to talk just briefly about relevance of place. A lot of you will recognize this place. Places can be relevant. Often people can tie relevance in some ways to nostalgia. If they have a personal memory. Next slide. If you've attended a game at Fenway, then this might have a lot of relevance to you, this image. It could be very localized too. So the next image is an image that a lot of Americans have seen at Concord, the Minuteman statue. And this probably resonates with more Americans because they this event in American history class. And so this has more national resonance, even though it's regional to you all. Next slide. Then this is just, I think this is a covered bridge in Vermont. Someone might know where this is. But a historic site like this could have great relevance to someone who lives in the local area or who rode their bike through it growing up, or it may not have national relevance as much, but we're talking communities and how something is relevant to a community. So historic preservation certainly understands that sites need to be relevant to be preserved.
Can I throw something in here? Just an observation.
Sure.
And that is the intersectionality, which I love that word here, the intersectionality of relevance. Thinking about how it's somebody is relevant to a person or whatever, but in different ways. LeBron, we started talking about LeBron at the very beginning. He's now an owner of the Boston Red Sox. And so, he's part of the ownership team. And that became something like, okay, if you're not a basketball fan, but you're a baseball fan, he's going to be very relevant moving forward with the Red Sox, and Major League Baseball. And it's a trend of, sports folks being involved in ownership, which is a major piece of, uplifting DEIJ and everything else. So, those connections are not to be discounted as well. You might be relevant for one thing or another to somebody one day, and it's to your point of the timing, but then you might be connected in another way with that thing. Very interesting.
So relevance is not the same as nostalgia. And the personal connection is really interesting. Whether or not you have a personal connection to something is important for relevance, whether or not it's relevant, but maybe not totally necessary. But we'll talk about that. So let's get talking a little more about defining relevance, and go for it, Richard.
So let's talk a little bit. I mean, we've dabbled around and we started to step into this a little bit, but I think the where we want to go right now is let's talk. To you, what does it mean to be relevant? Even more, what's the relationship between relevance and value? Is it possible for content to be fascinating but not relevant? And does relevance of history content change over time? I want to stop right there just for a moment, allow y'all some time to kind of ponder those questions, but I'd love to hear some of y'all's responses to this.
Okay, I've got a very simple example. A new pregnant mother, anything anyone can tell her about pregnancy, childbirth, infant rearing, clothes for babies, and all that stuff is very relevant and has a lot of value for her. 15 years later, she's not going to care about any of that. So yes, relevancy can change depending on your situation and the value of the information or the interaction, or yeah, what it means to you is definitely going to change over time.
That's fair. I can dig it. Anyone else?
I think something can definitely be fascinating but not relevant. Anyone who's done research and gone down some sort of rabbit hole finds it really interesting, but it may have nothing at all to do with what you're originally looking for or to your museum or your project or anything.
And that's kind of a question we should be thinking as museums and historic sites. And do we want to be a place of fascination, or do we want a place of fascination and relevance? If we're only a place of fascination, that only goes so far, I would say.
Yeah.
I've always thought of relevancy related to museums as it relates to meaning for our audiences and our community. I've always seen them as related.
Mm. I could agree with that. Dr. Crowley.
I was just going to jump off the point of fascinating a little bit because I'm the trustee of an archaeology museum, and we exhibit and interpret and talk about foundational technologies, stone tools, doing programs and interpreting what to some people look like a handful of gravel, but are actually extraordinary technological pieces that exist over time and are connected to cultures. There's this moment of discovery that people experience and enjoy, but I don't know that it's a moment of wonder, a moment of entertainment, but not always a connectivity of relevance, because these are such distant in time and technological forms and shapes that we have often a hard time making that relevancy connection for them. Just an example.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go with Gail Gifford.
Thank you. So I was looking at definitions of relevance, the dictionary definitions of relevance, and these jumped out at me. One is of interest, right? That is just sort of interest to whoever that audience is. But the other was having a bearing or being meaningful to the matter at hand, which is dependent upon what the matter at hand is, right, for you. And so connecting into that, even that, historical archaeology, if it can connect to the matter at hand, whatever that is that I'm thinking about, then it has relevance. But that may be, I think as we've been talking about, very, very conditional, right? So super conditional, like minutely, so depending upon where and what and where I am or not. So that's just what I'm musing on right now.
Oh, great point. Thank you. Catherine. Oh, we gotta get you done. Yeah, you go.
I think this is a little bit like what Gail was saying, but when I think about relevance, I would consider that it has a potential to impact the way I see the world or the decisions I am considering about the world. And so the more personal the decision, the more, I guess, personal the relevance is. And then there are things that as a community, we're all reflecting on, and that would imply a more global relevance.
It's a very interesting point, which for me makes me consider, and y'all gonna find that throughout this workshop, at least for me, and I think Tim and I've talked about the same thing. Like these workshops, we learn as much as it is that we give. So your point, and which connects to a couple of other things, it makes me think about our role And if I'm developing a program, if I'm putting that exhibit together, if my mindset leans more towards what's relevant to me, then I'm building an exhibit or I'm building a program for me, which is not going to, build the financial stability of the organization if I'm just building a program for me. It is, so in some way, shape, or form, it is, having a sense of people who are like us, but people who are unlike us, to have a sense of what's relevant to people outside of me. And then that seems to kind of put us in a position of putting our resources, our time, our content, and everything towards something that's going to be relevant for other people and maybe even helpful, in what people are dealing with in their day-to-day, sort of lives. Is just something that's coming to mind after listening to some of y'all's responses. Meg.
All right, so I'm loving this conversation. I have been thinking about building off both what Suanna and Meredith said, thinking about the relationship between relevance and value, where like something may not originally have been designed for you, but you can find, so it may not have immediately been relevant, but you find value in it anyway. For instance, using Meredith's example of young parents, curb cuts in sidewalks were not designed for parents pushing strollers. They were designed for people in wheelchairs, but there's a lot of value to all accessibility measures, ramps, elevators, etc., as much for people with strollers as there are for folks with mobility issues. So, there can be value in something that was maybe not originally intended to be relevant to you. There's also value in like the intangibles that may not immediately seem relevant, like in Suanna's example of stone tools. That kind of moment of wonder also is a moment to evoke a certain sense of like empathy and imagination, and there's a real value to that goes beyond relevance.
No, that's a really good point, and everything that y'all said is really kind of helps frame this next slide a little better. When we think about relevance, we've talked about on our end these sort of three spheres. This idea of how a relevance of history to society, which in many ways is a big picture sort of approach. We're also thinking about relevance of an organization to its community, which we kind of heard that in some of the response just a couple of minutes ago. But then there's also the relevance of an organization to the individuals that it engages through these sort of exhibitions, programs, the content, the mission, the purpose, all of those sorts of things. So these are three big things for us to consider and think about when we're talking and considering this idea of relevance, is that, how are we making this connection of history to society? How are we making this connection between us as an organization to our community? But then also, how are we making this connection or this relevance of the organization to the individuals that it engages? And in some ways, on that last one, I would appeal for us to think not just about people who are exterior or external of the organization, but also the internal employees. How is the organization relevant to the people in which it employs, and our volunteers as well? So
this is just a framework. If you could go back one slide. This is just a framework we've developed to think about relevance. There could be other spheres, I guess, of relevance, but this kind of makes sense when we were thinking about it. In the packet of materials that you received, there's a blog post that I wrote for the National Council for Public History blog, and it kind of it goes into these three spheres a little bit more. There's also a encyclopedia of local history entry on relevance included in the packet. I was asked to write one about relevance, so it's kind of me grappling with some of the things we talked about when we're trying to say, well, what is relevance? And so that's also in your your packet of materials that you received. So we can go to the next one, Richard. So I want to talk a little bit with us about history relevance. When we first started talking about relevance and history, there was a segment of people that said, we've been talking about relevance for years. This is nothing new. And our point with kind of establishing this group called the History Relevance Initiative, sometimes at first it was called the History Relevance Campaign, but it started around 2013. And the point of it was a group of history leaders around the country got together and said, history is not perceived as valuable and relevant. If you're equating value and relevance, which a lot of people do, it's not perceived as value because the money is not going to history. History education is not strong. Why aren't historians constantly being interviewed for articles about how historical events are shaping the present? You know, we don't always see historians interviewed. They're not the go-to people. So basically the reason that the group kind of started talking about relevance is they just wanted to raise the concept of relevance in the conversation that was happening in history organizations around the country. So let's talk about history and relevance. When you hear the word history, what do you think of? Anyone can throw out some thoughts. What do you think of?
Past.
Okay, past. What else do you think of?
Hi, I try to tell students, school students, when I get to go into schools, that anything that happened yesterday is history today. It doesn't have to be long time ago or any of that. It's
right.
It's already history.
Right, good point. What else do you think of when you hear the word history?
But it's not absolute. It depends on the perspective of the person telling it.
Right.
I think sometimes people use the word to imply not relevant, like, oh, that's ancient history.
Huh, that's good. That's interesting, yeah. Of course, we're a select audience here. Most of us work in history, and so we have something we tend to think of. But think about your friends and family. If they hear the word history, we all have people in our lives who don't necessarily have a positive image of history. So what do those people think about history?
It's a story.
Yeah, story.
I think stodgy, boring.
Yeah, boring.
I just think like whose history all the time, because the history that I learned always felt wrong or boring to me because it never included like the perspectives that would have otherwise affected my family, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a responsibility to record history. The last history book about Shirley was written in 1914, and a few things have happened since then. We just finished a project I'm proud of, even though it hasn't made us a lot of money. I had advertised wherever I could and wrote to people to give us their memory of the year 2020. And like, yes, it was just there, but if you don't write it down or record it somehow, a few years from now, you know, people could forget what it was really, really like. We ended up with 32 essays from a nurse, a politician, church leaders, students, parents, our Greenway Committee, all different aspects of our town society and their viewpoint of what it was like in 2020. And that's history. It's, you know, like just around the corner. But if it wasn't written down, 15, 20 years from now, people go say, ah, wasn't that bad, was it? So I think we have a responsibility to record the history when it's happening.
Thanks for sharing that.
I was just gonna give a little anecdote from some recent work that I did for the Smithsonian. And this was a large scale campaign on astrophysics, actually the first ever picture of a black hole. And I had to build a communications plan around announcing this discovery. And the entry point that seemed to work to help connect all this complex science was actually building the story on the history of the science and the history and of the connections of how these discoveries were made. I was sort of thinking of the comments about ancient history. And this is a little bit of the polar opposite, where we were actually invoking the concept of history to create relevance and connection for millions of people around the globe to see why this discovery was so important.
Thanks. Certainly, with the pandemic, I think we saw more talk about the 1918 pandemic, and so history. There was an effort, I think, by journalists and others to look back to it another time period. But overall, this is about making the case for why the past study of the past is important. And so, if you want to go to the next slide, Richard. The value of history statement is something that the History Relevance Initiative came up with. We spent a long time going to different groups, different conferences, and this is in your packet of materials. So if you want to take a look at that, it looks like this. So what it is it's 7 values, 7 ways that history is essential. We talked to various people in the field. The goal was to try to cover a broad spectrum of types of people. So we talked everyone from National History Day students and teachers to AHA. We went to AHA and talked to scholars and everyone in between. AAM, National Council for Public History, AASLH, lots of different groups to try to come up with these seven ways that history is valuable. And they cover lots of different segments. So hopefully you have that in front of you and you can see the 7 different areas there. So we have identity, critical skills. The skills that history teaches, the critical thinking skills, are very, very important. Identity, that's more for ourselves, but then vibrant communities, if we look at our communities, how history shapes our communities. You have the economic development. That was a area that we originally didn't have included among the 7, and the more we talked to different people, we realized that's important and that needs to be included. So we added that. Engaged citizens, leadership. We need examples of good leaders. Often those come from history. Legacy. I'm not going to read through the definitions of all these, but I encourage you to take some time after our workshop today and just read through this. We've had lots of feedback of organizations saying how useful it is to use this language. We're not saying this is the language people have to use. We're just saying this is a tool that we think people could borrow from when they want to make a case in various groups that they're talking to, whether it's a Chamber of Commerce or your docents, your volunteers, whoever you're talking to. You might find yourself having to make a good case for why history is important and valuable. And so this is a tool we hope that you will use. We were asking, and we still are actually, we're asking organizations to endorse the statement. And if you go to historyrelevance.com, you will see, I can't remember what the number is now. It's at least 400. It might be well over that, of organizations of all sizes and shapes that have endorsed the statement saying, you know, we believe in this statement and we hope to use it and plan to use it. Also in your packet, let me see if I can share my screen, is a document called The Value of History. And if you want to dig that out, this is an activity where we're going to spend a little time doing as part of this workshop. But I think because we're running a little low on time, short on time, I think we'll let you do that on your own after the workshop. But it's really an individual activity, but it's also an activity that works great with your staff or with your volunteers. And it's based on the Value of History statement. And what it is it looks at each value and we say, look at how your organization uses these values. How much do you focus on identity in what you're doing? How much do you teach critical skills to visitors or the people that you interact with? So you kind of rate how much your organization uses the priority, I guess, that you place on each of these values. And then you prioritize, in the second column, you prioritize all of them. So think about all 7 at your organization. Would you say legacy is the main one? That's your priority that you focus on at the moment. And this might change certainly over time. So a year from now, you might be focusing on different values. That's just a really interesting exercise to do with different groups of people at your organization. So I encourage you to take that sheet and to try to do this exercise with different groups of people. Anyone have questions about it? I'm curious how many people have seen or heard of the Value of History statement. Has anyone heard of it before? Most people haven't. Okay, well, good. Hope you'll take some time to look at it. Next slide. Take a minute and read this. So you may agree with this or disagree with it. Anyone want to comment on whether they agree or disagree with this?
I love this statement, although I'm not a fan of the word should. And I like to think more in terms of possibility than obligation. Mm-hmm. So if I were to edit it, I would probably change that little.
Okay. Okay. But generally, it sounds like you agree with it.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else have a thought about it?
I have a reaction. What it reminds me of is so I'm a retired school teacher, but one of the things that they were asking teachers to do when I was in the system at the end was you had to tell your class why you were doing this lesson. Why are you teaching this concept? The thought being, if they understood the relevance to them, how it connected, why learn algebra? If you can't convince someone that they should learn algebra, it's going to be a tough road. So this is very similar to that, I think.
That's a great point. As a kid, I hated algebra because I didn't see how it was relevant to me. Any other thoughts? If not, we'll move on. Let's move to the next.
I have a thought, sorry.
That's
I
okay.
think about this because I'm actually coming from an art museum, not a history museum. And I think this is something that art museums do all the time, or like think about all the time, like, except that I think the way that we do it is like, the piece that makes me afraid about this is like, then there's an assumption that has to be made about in what way the person will care about it. Does that make sense? And I think like this is something that art museums struggle a lot with too. Like you can't just be like, I worked at one institution once where it was like a show about Latinx art. And they were like, okay, so you're definitely gonna like it and your whole family's gonna like it because that's you or whatever, you know? And I was like, okay, I don't know. I might not. I also like other art too. And so I think it comes down to maybe rather than, I don't know, like demonstrating why people should care, it's more about like inviting opportunities for people to tell you why they care. Or you know what I mean? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Conversation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because as you said earlier, we can make a lot of assumptions as to what's going to, be attractive to people or connect to people. And when we lead off with assumptions in that way, I can't tell you how many times people come to me and because I am Black, they think that a Black program or a Black exhibit is what I should care about or I'm going to connect to. And I'm always an advocate for no, I'm actually interested in a whole lot of stuff. I like learning new stuff too. That doesn't have anything to do with my right.
You're like, okay, also there's more than just like the 3 Black main history figures that always get talked about, right? Or something like that. Like you're like, it could be more expansive than maybe how you're like, I feel that like Frida Kahlo, I'm like, okay, cool. There's also other artists besides Frida Kahlo too,
Right.
I don't know.
No, that's a good point.
I'm wondering if I could just jump in too on this, and that I'm thinking back to some work I did around education, and I've just come off of a board of a public high school, charter school, and I was thinking sort of what's the role of education, right? And we have narrowed it down currently to work and career, preparing you for work and career, right? But the sort of pieces around, and in looking at this that go to, participating in a democratic society, right? So the ability to participate in a democratic society. But another piece that's left out, and I think this goes to that fascination question, is living a fulfilled life, right? Which is more than just identity, right? It's so there's some knowledge and core knowledge and a way to interpret. And Olivia, I think this goes to art museums, right? Is this living a fulfilled life, and how do I define that, and what's part of that? And I like us not to forget that piece of this work as well. And those are from Tony Wagner, who was or is at Harvard. So just some thoughts.
We are going to talk more about the fascinating versus relevant spectrum a little later in the workshop. Any other thoughts on this statement? We can move to the next slide. Here's a big question that I hear every now and then is, should we attempt to be relevant to everyone? Can you even be relevant to everyone? Our collection is XYZ. It's not relevant to certain groups of people. That's making an assumption, obviously. What do you think? Can you? Should you attempt to be relevant to everyone?
I think it depends on the nature of the organization. And if you're like a big comprehensive art museum, I think the answer is yes, because it's very broad. But there might be situations where if you're like a little specialty museum, it might be less relevant to some people.
I think about this from like types of learners rather than types of audiences, if that makes sense. Because I feel like, I don't know, ideally I'd love to maybe be relevant to everyone, although I don't always know if sometimes you don't want that. Like sometimes there's an exhibition that's meant for certain people to like really connect to in a different way, you know? Maybe it's like making sure that your exhibition or whatever always has different points of accessibility in terms of learning so that people can connect to it in that way. But it might not be that they always find every single piece of information or whatever to, you know, be super relevant to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I thought of this in terms of, so I'm a museum educator, and in terms of a teacher or educator, you're looking for ways to teach your content to your class, which is going to encompass a lot of different types of people. So educators, especially, like you said, are looking for ways to convey material and get people engaged in content. Communications people are also looking for ways to communicate a message with lots of different types of audiences. And they find it a challenge to do that. So if we adapt that mindset, maybe sometimes I think you can be relevant, and sometimes I think, no, you can't. So I don't have an answer personally. But what are some other thoughts?
I was just going to jump in and say, I think about it slightly differently as one of those communications people. And I think about it as trying to be welcoming to everyone, but maybe not relevant to everyone. You have to have sort of that brand identity, your specialization as an institution, but you can certainly be welcoming to all kinds of audiences, all kinds of people, all kinds of exhibit materials. It's just a matter of that messaging piece.
That's a good point. And I'll add to this in that, you know, I think there's two separate questions. One, should your organization attempt to be relevant? And to some extent, I lean to, yeah, that should be at least an attempt. And the reason why I say that is just because of what we were talking about earlier in terms of, I just want to be careful that I'm not making an assumption that Carol Parker doesn't like hip hop music. So this hip hop exhibit, she's not going to, you know, be into. She may be. She may, you know, have some Adidas and a Run DMC hat, and, you know, I don't know. But in my thought, it makes me think maybe I should at least attempt to, but I should also at the same time frame be manage my expectation that it's not necessarily going to be relevant to everyone. So my attempting to versus my expectation of what I'm able to accomplish could also be two separate things, which might guide, you know, how I move forward with an exhibit or a program or anything of that nature. And I thought I saw somebody's hand up. Maybe not. But that's just something I was thinking about as I was listening to y'all talk. It's a good point.
I think we can be relevant at different levels too. We
Yeah.
might be a little relevant to some and really, really relevant to others.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Really good.
Of course, measuring it is a whole different topic, which we can talk about later. How do you measure that? But
I guess what I would add to this question, or what comes to mind for me, is the tension of like acknowledging that we already are being exclusive. Like the history of museums has always been exclusive to like a certain point of view or a certain type of people. And so, because my worry is that sometimes this question is used by institutions to just feel like they can just continue to perpetuate, well, we're just not for everybody and that's okay, right? And so like actually acknowledging that like a lot of those assumptions have a lot of underlying bias. And so then if you don't invest on making the effort, while like I like this idea of like managing expectation and pairing that with also long-term investment. I think museums often struggle with being like, well, we did do that one thing and it didn't quite work out, as if like that makes up for like centuries of relationship building with other audiences that you have, which are largely demographically white or upper upper, middle class, like that there's a lot of barriers there that require actually like I think the first question is like, who are you currently relevant to? Who is that leaving out? Because otherwise I do worry that a lot of institutions are then like, well, then that's okay. We're just not for everyone. And that's all right. Instead of actually dissecting, well, it's not that we're not for everyone. It's that currently we are for XYZ. And so where's the rest of the alphabet there?
That's a good point. Dan, did you have a comment?
Dan.
Yeah, can I play off that? Maria, excellent concept of how are we strategic about our relevance, because so often you've got the case that, it's almost like you're watching Nero fiddling while Rome burns, right? You have a museum that was built on, sort of white industrialist capital, in a place then, community that is rapidly changing demographically, and they're sort of surrounded by a community that's completely different than it was when when the museum was built. And yet they just double down on it. And to your point, we tried to bring the community in and it didn't work and whatever. But then, it's like, well, why would the community want to come into this place that was built on, white patriarchy when everything else is, whatever. And sooner or later, you will not be relevant anymore because, it's like your community is gone, your capital is gone, your philanthropy is gone, everything's gone, and the place just sort of collapses in on itself. And I think that's the urgency that a lot of our institutions face, is like, you better wake up, folks, because, being relevant today to, sort of still clinging to the old ways of doing things versus what's happening in the community. You got to be involved in, your community of stakeholders, whether that's your immediate physical community or, a much broader community, especially now virtually. But it's frightening to see people just double down on, sort of the old ways. Wake up, folks. Anyway, that's my comment. But so the question though maybe is like, how do we incorporate relevance into our strategy? And maybe we'll be getting to that. But that strategic component is going to be critical, I think, as we move forward.
And I'm going to jump in real quick because I'm going to come to Gail, but I noticed something in my language and I didn't hear it until Dan spoke, and then I referenced back. And something that we might want to consider, and I have to consider this more just in my own realm, is how often I talk, when I'm talking about museums and I'm talking about the community. I think sometimes I even confuse myself, because when I'm talking about the community in my mind, I generally lean to the Black, Brown, Indigenous people who haven't been served by institutions before. And I'm reminded of living in Minnesota in some of those rural areas where that community is not Black, Brown, and Indigenous. That community, that geographic community around that historic site within a 50, 100-mile radius is 97.9% white folks, the traditional audience who's already come. And so I'm reminding myself now publicly that when I think about community or when I speak about community, I probably need to be a little more mindful that the people the underserved or the people who haven't been served before isn't necessarily synonymous with community, especially in different areas. And so if anything, I thank y'all for this conversation. It helps me remember that in the language, because we do want to serve the community. Sometimes those communities are actually being served, but those communities don't look like the underserved, folks that we want to be part of, the experiences. So just a couple of thoughts there. But Gail, I think there's Gail who had something, hand raised.
Yeah, most of what I was thinking, a lot of you have covered about relevance. I guess the one point I would add to that is you can attempt to be more relevant to whatever your community may be, but you cannot force them to come and partake of it. You need to also work on being welcoming and inviting. And yes, we are here for you. I'm not putting it well, but you can't just force people to appreciate your attempts to be relevant.
That's a good point. You cannot force relevance.
This is kind of like a maybe an annoying question, but something that I've been thinking about sometimes, just even with my own institution, is also like, so maybe it's okay if people also just don't want to come. Like, is that terrible? I know that maybe I shouldn't put that out there, but
No,
like I've been thinking about, like, my dad isn't someone that goes to museums, but he loves art, and that's okay too. And so like maybe I think obviously open the chance for people to come, but also it's also okay if some people just don't want to too. I don't know. Is that throwing a wrench in it too much? I'm sorry.
no, not at all. But I would say, what would make that person want to come? What kind of program could you do that would interest them?
So can I jump in on that a little bit, Tim?
Yeah,
Because I'm
please do.
thinking, in part of this relevance conversation has maybe stayed a little more on the content side than the experience of, right? So Maria mentioned, I think it was Maria, right, who mentioned the different ways of learning and accessing. And it reminds me of, so RISD and the Mass Cultural Council, I think, has been rolling this out. RISD, some artists there did a project with the museum called Look at Art, Get Paid. And what they did, they advertised on buses, they paid people who were not traditional museum goers to come to the RISD Museum and experience it. And then they debriefed them. And so many of the comments around welcoming and access had to do with the vessel, right? The content, the cultural experience of what an art museum was that they were not familiar with and didn't understand, and therefore that wasn't welcoming, that challenged practices that are pretty embedded in museums, right? So, people wanted to know, they didn't feel comfortable with security guards in the room and felt, that the security guards were watching them or following them, which they do, right? And they didn't understand why people were like talking in whispers or why you couldn't touch things, right? And there's like a whole series of stuff around that. So I think relevance has to also go to thinking about how the culture works in those spaces and not just the meaningfulness of the content. And, as someone who grew up in a very working class background and never went to a museum until really, a friend of mine in a much more middle class background in high school brought me to my first museum, I didn't know what to expect. I mean, I had that same thing around, I'd never been to a restaurant besides McDonald's. Like, what do you do? So there's just a lot around education and access that is about changing the way we welcome and also how we help people understand the sort of more traditional experience and how to get something out of it. So I just want to speak to kind of both sides of that.
Thank you. Well, this is kind of a good time to transition from the first sphere to the second sphere. And the second sphere we've been actually talking about is community, relevance to community. And we want to have a small group conversation. We're going to show you some videos of 4 sites, I think. These are the questions we hope each group will discuss. We're going to do 4 different chat rooms. And for those of you who may not have done this before, you get put into one. And then we hope that you will talk about these questions, and we'll leave these questions on the screen. But we're all going to watch all the videos. And go to the next slide, Richard. These are the places. So when we meaning the History Relevance Initiative folks, when we first looked around for groups that were doing, places that were doing really good examples, we said, submit what you're doing about relevance. If you think you're really being relevant, let us know about it. And we asked that they also have documentation, so they had to have done evaluation. And that was really, really hard to find because history museums are not so great at doing evaluation for quality, I should say, beyond demographics and things like that. But then analyzing the evaluations they do. That was even harder to find, the data. So all of that to say is there's some good work being done out there, but it's not always easy to find documentation of it. These are 4 sites that have come to our attention over the years. One, President Lincoln's Cottage, is in Washington, D.C. The Tenement Museum, I'm sure everyone has heard of, in New York City. The Harriet Beecher Stowe Center is in your part of the world, Hartford. And then Eastern State Penitentiary is in Philadelphia. And so we're going to play these videos, and then each group will discuss one of these places. So you want to play them? Do I need to mute, I guess?
For just $67, you can make as many videos as you want.
Oh yeah, we gotta skip
never
past
need
this.
to pick up a camera or use any.
All right, here we go.
Students Opposing Slavery is an award-winning youth education and modern abolitionist program at President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington, D.C.
Did you all see the video?
I'm Callie Hawkins. I'm the director of
can't see the
programming
video.
here at the
Richard,
college.
I think you need to
Today,
share
I'd like
your
to share with you
screen
a little bit
instead of the
about
PowerPoint
2017
presentation.
Summit.
Yeah, share the screen. That might work.
All right, there we go. Cool. Now let's get to the real video so y'all can see it. Get back to that screen. There it is. Let's rewind it a little bit. Let's do that. Let's do this. Share screen. And there we go. Share sound. Boom.
Students Opposing Slavery is an award-winning youth education and modern abolitionist program at President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington, D.C. I'm Callie Hawkins, and I'm the director of programming here at the Cottage. And today I'd like to share with you a little bit about the 2017 Summit, which we held here from June 26th through June 30th. But first, a little history. While living at the Cottage, Abraham Lincoln led the nation through civil war and developed the Emancipation Proclamation, major events on the road to abolition of legal slavery in the United States. We recognize that with the passage of the 13th Amendment, and that slavery is illegal, but it persists in many forms around the world today. In 2012, the International Labor Organization estimated that 20.9 million people were subjected to this brand of injustice, an injustice that generates annual illegal profits of roughly $150 billion. From the forced, unpaid production of everything from bricks to diamonds to garments, global slavery is as diversified as it is destructive. In the United States alone, more than 7,000 cases of modern slavery were reported in 2016. President Lincoln's Cottage is dedicated to planting the seeds of Lincoln's brave ideas around the world so that all people everywhere can be free. To date, 136 students have attended the summit from 23 countries around the world. This past summit, held from June 26th to June 30th, 2017, President Lincoln's Cottage hosted 26 students from 8 states and 5 countries, including the United States, India, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. The students spent a week learning about modern-day slavery, listening to experts in the anti-slavery field, including representatives from nonprofits, federal agencies, and even survivors of modern slavery. Throughout the week, students were given tools and resources, including team-building opportunities and chances to work together to grow a global network of youth abolitionists. Most importantly, though, over the 5 days, students brainstormed, constructed, peer-reviewed, and presented modern slavery awareness campaigns that they would take back and introduce into their schools and communities. 17-year-old Arit traveled from Calcutta, India for the summit. Previously, Arit had worked with Ruchira Gupta, the founder and president of APNIAP Worldwide, an NGO that aims to end sex trafficking. Arit explained,
start another campaign, perhaps, to try and get this issue out there in India, because people try to ignore it and are indifferent to it. So we're going to start a campaign, and get the word out really, and overwhelm people with with something that I can be able to do, because you cannot bring change unless you are overwhelmed.
President Lincoln's Cottage is really excited to plan for the 2018 summit, which we'll hold here next summer. We'd love to have you be involved in continuing Lincoln's fight for freedom with us and to be a part of the generation that says enough to modern slavery. I'm Callie Hawkins, Director of Programming at President Lincoln's Cottage. We look forward to seeing you soon and to answering any questions you might have about students opposing slavery. If students would like to get involved, they can certainly apply to be involved in the summit. Applications will be available.
You have to unmute, Tim.
So that was a youth program that was connected to a small exhibit that they did about human trafficking. And the reason they did the exhibit is because their site was where President Lincoln thought a lot about and worked on the Emancipation Proclamation. So that was the connection, but making the topic relevant to today. It was supposed to be a one-time program, but it became so popular and got funding, and it's now a program that they have done every year for a number of years. The exhibit is no longer there, it's been long gone, but the program still exists.
All right, next up is a look inside the Lower East Side Tenement Museum.
America's a great nation. It's lived through these amazing events like the Civil War, the Great Depression. We remember the politicians, we remember the people who are thrust into power and leave their legacy. But it's people that live through those events. It's people that die in those wars. There's people that build the bridges. The stories we tell are about those people, and not that many places tell those stories.
What we do here at the Tenement Museum is we collect the stories of ordinary new Americans, people starting their lives here, and see what they did to survive.
We're going to go into that building, 97 of Orchard. It was built at the same time as Lincoln was president.
It was important to me that the Tenement Museum become a storytelling museum. People remember stories much more than facts. If the facts are hung onto the tree of a story, they become relevant, they become memorable.
Ruth's genius was to identify an abandoned tenement, a condemned building, as a museum. In effect, to put up a sign and say, this is a place where we can tell America's most important story.
The mission of the museum is to engage people in the power of the past, to make them think about the present.
So, one flight up to Natalie Gumpertz's home. Follow me.
So we tell them the stories of the immigrants who lived at 97 Orchard, and in telling the stories of those immigrant families, we talk about the context of the time, what were the issues of the time.
By the 1900s, with all of these families coming in, all of these families working, we are looking at the largest Jewish city in the world. We are looking at the most densely populated place on Earth. Imagine how it looks outside. Well, let's take a look at what this block that we're just on looks like in 1898. Wow. So what I want to take is I want to take this little boy and I want to follow him. Because if we follow him, eventually he'll lead us to Harry Levine's garment factory.
Being in the space where ordinary families came and they adapted their traditions to America, they adapted their customs to America, there was something almost sacred about this, about thinking about how that played out in these spaces and how these people in turn, through their jobs, built the subways or built the unions or stitched the clothing that America wears. These were the people that were shaping New York history and American history.
It's much more relevant when you see where they lived, what they went through, humanized history.
What do you all think about the Schneider's home? Tight, cozy.
What the museum does that makes them different is that there is a storyteller kind of guiding people through our space.
Do you all see ways in which this couple, though, is kind of working toward the American dream or achieving the American dream?
As educators, we're here to facilitate, to create an environment in which conversation can happen.
You are every day involved and interacting with people, and if you're lucky, you will shift somebody's point of view about something, and that's really meaningful.
So this is what Bridget and Joseph's world is like, right? I'm going to ask all of you, just from where you sit and from what you see, who are today's Irish? Who are today's outsiders?
After the last election, for instance, there was a lot of talk about how Hispanics are coming in and voting in a certain way, and there was a kind of a terror.
I had this Chinese immigrant who came, and after the tour said, does anybody have anything to say about what they saw? And this Chinese woman, she goes, I never knew that this happened in New York in the past and that people live this way, and now I see my own life in a completely different light.
We don't just talk about the past. We like people to think about the present and their own communities and what the experience is for immigrants living next door to them today.
The things we talk about here matter. Issues to do with national identity, civics. We tackle it every day in those tenement apartments.
It connects the present and the past. That you're now realizing the story continues and that maybe we still have work to do.
I'm curious how many people have been to the Tenement Museum? A few people have. So the next site we're going to do is Harriet Beecher Stowe House Center. How many have been to Hartford to the Stowe Center? A few people. So this program started, you'll see Catherine Kane, some of you probably know her. She's no longer director there, she's now in Colorado. And they may not be doing what they started, but I think we include this because we think the concept of what they were trying to do, the shift they were trying to make with their interpretation is a really good thing to consider.
And Tim, we got a couple of hands up. You want to get those now or?
Oh yeah, I don't see them, but just speak out if you have a comment.
I think it was about your question if you have been to either of those museums.
Oh, okay.
Got you. Okay. Let's pull up this next one. Catherine Kane.
Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was the best-selling novel of the 19th century. Published in 1852, the anti-slavery novel helped lay the groundwork for the Civil War. I'm Eric Clemens for Comcast Newsmakers at Comcast's Connecticut studio. Joining us today is the Executive Director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, Catherine Kane. Catherine, welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
Good to have you with us. Who was Harriet Beecher Stowe, And what's her Connecticut connection?
Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe is a 19th century author, born in Connecticut in 1811 and wrote 30 books.
Wow.
But she's best known for the international bestseller, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which changed American attitudes before the Civil War and is credited by historians with helping get that war started.
What spurred Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Well, it was both personal and professional. It was a lively political time in the mid-19th century when Americans were discussing whether or not they were going to retain slavery. And she was angry about that political situation. And in her personal life, she lost a toddler to cholera, a child of hers who died suddenly. And that made her empathize with women who were living in slavery and had no control over their own children. And so she put all of those feelings into this book. And it made, and those feelings, she was very successful with that writing and connected with Americans all across the country.
Would you call her a one-hit wonder with that book?
No, actually, she wasn't a one-hit wonder. What a good question. She wrote 30 books. She became internationally famous. 3 other books that were anti-slavery books, and then many other stories, hymns, short stories, poems, novels, and, as I said, internationally famous. Invited by British anti-slavery groups to come and visit in England and Scotland in the early 1850s, and was treated like a rock star.
Specifically, what was the impact of the Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Many impacts. So it was an international bestseller. In the United States, it sold 10,000 copies in the first week it was published, and 300,000 copies in the first year. In Great Britain, it sold 1.5 million copies in the first year. We don't have numbers like that today. And then, of course, it had a social and political impact as well that remains with us. So it has fomented revolution in various countries from Cuba to the Philippines and Russia.
I was going to ask, is it still popular today?
Well, outside the United States, most people read it. Inside the United States, most people don't read it, which is absolutely crazy.
What will people find when they visit the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center? I hear it's not a typical house museum.
Well, we have Stowe's final home in Hartford, Connecticut, and invite all of your watchers to come and visit. You can find out more from harrietbeecherstowe.org. And this is Stowe's home. It's a domestic environment on a site with 2 other historic houses and lovely gardens. And what we are trying to do at the Stowe Center is use Stowe's story to inspire positive change. So we want people who visit to think about what issues are important to them. We use Stowe as an example, but what's important to the visitors. So,
what will people find inside the house itself?
They will find a domestic environment, a home with all of Harriet Beecher Stowe's own furniture and decorative arts and china and pictures that she painted and that she bought, family memorabilia. It's like your own home, only it's from the 1880s and an internationally famous woman.
I understand in addition to tours, you offer discussion-based programs called Salons at Stowe. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, since Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, best known for Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was an anti-slavery book, we program around contemporary issues that relate to the legacy of slavery. And there's still human trafficking going on in the States. Yes. So we use those headline issues in a really well-regarded program called Salons. We sit down with the public and we discuss this week's issue, for example, and in a facilitated conversation, and look for solutions to problems.
Preservation is important to the Stowe Center mission. Tell us, if you will, what's happening to preserve the Stowe House?
Well, of course, the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center is a museum, so we have special collections that we want to preserve, and Stowe's house is our largest artifact. So for the first time since we opened in 1968, we're doing a major interior renovation of Stowe's house, so that we can provide a better experience for the public. So over the next few months, you can come by and see how that experience is going.
How can people get in touch with you?
You check out our website at harrietbeecherstowe.org.
Catherine, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of Comcast Newsmakers. I'm Eric Clemens. We'll see you next time.
So if you haven't been to the Stowe Center, one thing they were trying to do, I'm not sure if they do it now, I haven't been there in a couple of years, but it's not your normal tour of a house. They added moments for discussion where the tour group sits down and really talks about topics and issues, and that was something different that a lot of places weren't doing. So this is our final video. It's pretty short. I will say it's a marketing focused video, but it gets across some interesting points.
So what do y'all think? Matter of fact, let me bring back up
Question slide.
the question slide. Yep. There it is. And let's share that screen. Current slide. There we go. So thinking through the videos and just thinking through some of these questions, I mean, what kind of thoughts do you all have? Again, the questions are, in what ways do these videos, these sites demonstrate relevance? What, if any, values of history are being used? What programs, exhibits, etc., are used to convey those values? What are the takeaways for other museums and historic sites? And do these sites demonstrate a difference between fascinating and relevant in their presentation of history? Any thoughts?
One thing I noticed is that every single one of them, the relevance was for a major global issue as opposed to just their local community. And I say just advisedly, but you know, the idea that all of these are sort of huge topics, slavery and, well, prison reform and the like. Noting that.
Good point. You're right. For the examples that we have here, yeah, you're right.
Right. They bit off a lot, you know. I mean, when you think about, well, okay, how do we how do we take what we've got? And you know, the Stowe Center is one that maybe we're more familiar with in New England. It started out as a historic house, right? And they, you know, did the historic house thing. And then they decided that they were going to take on, you know, sort of this more amplified mission, which was its own process. But man, I can imagine that. Well, I do know some of the thought process that went behind it, talking with Catherine over the course of time.
A good point. And before we come to Betsy, I think that's an interesting point for us to continue to put up front and center, especially if you're building master plans or strategic plans or the like. You know, we've got I have a new client now who's trying to wrestle between whether they want to do the big issues, like are they globally centric or are they locally centric? And this has become a very interesting conversation amongst the client themselves and the local community, because on one hand they want to, you know, this sort of economic development requires that this new museum that they put up, for them in their mind, they want to be global because they want to make as much money as possible, right? But one of the things that we asked them to reconsider is, you know, what level of impact do you want to have, and is the impact, you know, more achievable at a national level, or better to achieve at a local level? And that's where they are right now, and trying to make that distinction as to, you know, where they want to place their focus and emphasis. That's a really good point, Dan. Thank you. Betsy.
Yeah, I was just interested in the way in which the different museums addressed contemporary issues. It seemed many, particularly those like that was a house where you were seeing the setting, and suddenly you were involved in a conversation, the emphasis on salons and discussion with trained facilitators, almost seeking out from visitors information who would then make the connection themselves. And the Lincoln was also very similar in that way, in the education for the young, and also the museum teachers or docents on the floor of the tenement, whereas the penitentiary was quite different. It was a bit more leading questions, and they used exhibits with statements, and almost presenting a point of view, as opposed to bringing it up and letting the visitor take it in different directions. For instance, the question, and also using sort of static exhibits. It's kind of unfair to say that because you couldn't see the whole thing and how they handled it. But one of the questions in the exhibit was, have you ever broken the law? A sort of a yes/no answer, rather than the open-ended inquiry kinds of connections the other institutions were making. And I'm wondering if that flows down from a mission statement to begin with, that dictated the manner in which they were going to create these connections.
Good point.
Tracy.
Just a few observations with, first of all, with Harriet Beecher Stowe's home. I love the idea of including discussion in a typical daily tour, allowing some time for your visitors in your group to sit or not and discuss a little bit of what they've been experiencing. The Tenement Museum, I can't wait to go and see it. I've only been to New York City twice, and the last time I went, I was planning on going, and my friends did not want to spend the money it costs to go there, and that's one little bit of an issue I have there. I'm assuming their school groups that they charge, but just for the typical person to go, it's I just looked it up. It's $30 for me to go to the Tenement Museum. Now I can afford that, but you know, it's something that you want to be relevant, but you need to be relevant to everybody who can afford it. So that's just again an observation. Not I don't mean to criticize, but an observation. And then lastly, with Lincoln Cottage, I went there not long after it opened. It's a great site. It was before they started this program that was highlighted in the video. I'd be curious to know, I'm assuming that that program is for certain groups, for students, I guess, but I wonder now with their typical daily tour, do they introduce any of that relevant topic, or do they stick more to just the history of Lincoln? And that's it. I'll stop now.
I do know that they just opened an exhibit about grieving. The Lincolns were grieving the death of their son Willie when they were there, and I haven't seen the exhibit yet because it just opened. But there was a Washington Post article about it, and making connections with grieving that we deal with today as well. So they're again attempting to be taking a historical topic and make it relevant to today.
And to point out something that somebody mentioned earlier, because initially when we were talking about relevance, we were talking about, you know, the relative nature of the content. But to expand outside of the content and think more along the lines of the presentation. Excuse me 1 second, baby girl. Hold on 1 second. The presentation of the content, and Betsy, I think this gets to your point in that I know that Lincoln's Cottage, the Tenement Museum, and Eastern State Penitentiary have all sort of ascribed to a dialogue facilitation model and how they present the information rather than sort of a you know, an information based, let me tell you this information. So that's why you get the types of questions of you know, the types of questions that anyone can generally answer. Like, have you ever done a crime? You know, well, we can answer that in the 21st century. Whereas if I were to say, has Joe Blow, this historical figure, ever committed a crime? Well, if you don't know the history of Joe Blow, you may not be able to answer that successfully. And so a lot of that, I think, you know, the means by which how you can create something to be relative, aside from the content, is just the manner in which of how you're facilitating the discovery or facilitating people understanding, you know, the relative nature of the information. I hope I said that clear. I probably could have said that in one sentence.
Of course, obviously, dialogue-based programming has its own challenges, and if you're committing to that, then you have to have really people that are trained well in facilitation. And
just as an aside, I don't know if you all went to the AASLH meeting in Philadelphia a couple of years ago. They had an event at Eastern State, and you should have seen the sheepish looks of people in that exhibit amongst their colleagues. You have to sort of publicly declare whether you've ever committed a crime or not. And you are such a liar. I know you are. Everyone, all these people going, I've never committed a crime. Lie.
And those conversations, Dan, were very relevant just amongst history professionals. We all standing around looking at each other, trying to figure out, you know, what kind of past people have had. That was very relevant.
I gave some props to my colleagues who went off to the right or whatever. It's like, all right.
So I just wanted to just underscore the power of personal interaction. Just, you know, I think as we think more of interactive media, that, you know, having a great conversation with somebody and having really informed and provocative tour guides, docents, facilitators, you know, whatever you want to call them, is just so powerful. The other piece that came through to me in all of these was their desire to connect relevance to more than just the issue, right? So like there were different issues offered, beyond the kind of bigger one. And some of those even just went to like the belt notcher, right? Like, you should come visit this place, or you should come be part of this place because we're the biggest, the best, the award-winning, the this, the that, the other, right? So for those folks who want to just tick off that they've been to a place, or the prison talking about its architecture, right? I mean, I don't associate prisons necessarily with fascinating and beautiful architecture, but they were saying, you know, there are other ways to enter this story than just from the sort of main story here. And so let's think about how to do that too in terms of relevance.
Yeah, I think that makes me think about this last question where you're asking about the difference between fascinating and relevant, but I think these organizations used the fascinating aspects of their organizations to as a portal to relevance. Mm-hmm. I think you really need both. It's not either or.
I'm also thinking about the managing expectations that was brought up before, because I've never been to the Eastern State Penitentiary Museum before. However, the thing that I picked up on immediately in that video is how they said that they are willing to hold difficult conversations, but are bipartisan, i.e. they don't take a side, don't take a stance. And I was thinking about that because for them to be truly relevant, I would want them to take a stance. And I don't know if that's a case of having to manage the expectations, but I guess it's that question then of when is the content not enough anymore?
I don't know what they would today, if they did that video, I don't know if they would say the same thing. That's a few years old, that video. They're still bipartisan, but I think they might say they take more of a stand. I don't know. Anyone? Richard, do you know?
Yeah. So, since that video was done, this is when the onset of the museums are not neutral, movement. And Sean and the good folks over at Eastern State Penitentiary have been, at the forefront of a lot of that conversation. And so I think they all say that they are, bipartisan or maybe even nonpartisan. And I think that's probably more appropriate now that they would say that they're nonpartisan and that they're more in tune with taking a stand and the fact that the story needs to be told, and we're gonna step into the good, bad, the completely horrible, regardless. And I think they can be successful in doing that because their name and their brand is so big and so large. It does become a little more complicated for some of the smaller institutions that are more community centric and or places that aren't trying to get that global or national sort of appeal. Gail.
There we go. I think that the term, if I'm recalling correctly, that they were using in the Eastern State Penitentiary was nonpartisan, which is indeed different from bipartisan. And a couple of thoughts. I suspect that most of these were made pre-2016 and certainly pre-2020. And as you said, they might all be doing things a little bit differently. If they were, when they reopen at full speed, they may do things a little bit differently. And the other thing is about museums are not neutral, and I agree museums should take a stand. But kind of the flip side of that is if you are nonpartisan and present more than one side of a story, you may actually have luck in convincing somebody. There's a lot of research that you will have better luck changing somebody's mind if you listen to their point of view and attempt at least to be empathetic rather than shove down their throats why they are wrong and why you are right. So I'm not saying museums should not be neutral, but being willing to let people express their points of view may have some effect in changing their points of view. That's it.
Yep.
Great point. And one thing that and Betsy, I'm looking at you because I think you were the one who was saying earlier about building a plan for a new site. One of the things that's been talked about at least a few of these places is they've kind of identified what their non-negotiables are, or in other words, what does their institution believe? And in that belief, that's how they've started to jump off as to what where are the boundaries for the organization? Where are we willing to have conversations, and where are we just simply not going to have that conversation? So in some cases, you see institutions say, we're not going to talk about whether the Holocaust is real or not. We're not going to talk about whether slavery was good for the nation or not. We know these things. This is the stand that we're taking. And if you want to talk about those things, but that's just necessarily the experience or the place for that piece of conversation. And so I'm finding that more and more institutions are embracing these sort of non-negotiables. And I'm actually an advocate for talking about non-negotiables at a program level first, before we start getting into an institutional level, especially for new organizations. For every program you do, if you're doing a program about Indigenous people, okay, well, what does your organization believe that is the foundation for that experience, so that exhibit to go out? And I've been finding that that sort of approach has been very helpful in, not being neutral, but also leaving the space open enough for some real conversation, as long as the institution and the people who are coming are both on the same page as to what the boundaries are. When they aren't, then that's where it can get a little tense and whatnot.
There's also maybe something helpful. I noticed in the chat people were talking about like heavy topics, and I think we have to define who gets to decide what a heavy topic is and like what's off limits for museums, because it's like too serious. And I think with these examples, it's helpful to kind of think about the flip side of that. Like if Eastern State wasn't talking about mass incarceration, then what are they talking about? Is it just prison tourism? Like they came out a few years ago and talked a lot about gift shops at prison museums, and like selling soap in a gift shop at a prison museum in order to make jokes about rape in prison is not actually okay. And they had to like actually come out and say that. So if we think about what the opposite of that, of what they're doing is it not dealing with something, especially when we think about the museums are not neutral movement. And so like, if we don't talk about the origin, like what happened at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center and how her book set off this series of events that helped contribute to the start of the Civil War, and we don't like kind of tear that apart a little bit, then are we just talking about white saviorism? At a place like the Tenement Museum, if we aren't kind of contextualizing it within current events and like larger movements, is it just poverty tourism? Like there's all of these, I think we have to kind of think about what happens when we don't deal with these topics and we don't make these connections in order to like help explain why we're doing the work that we're doing.
I just want to jump in here and make a quick note before we go any further. It is 10 past noon, and we are supposed to be going to lunch break and then reconvening. So in deference to anyone who might have like a commitment between noon and 1:30 before we reconvene, I just wanted to check in with Richard and Tim to see if this was a good place to pause or if we wanted to keep going for a bit longer.
It's a very good place to pause, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hate to squash a conversation because this is fantastic, but I'm also just trying to be aware of the time and make sure, if there's anybody who has a kid to feed or another meeting to hop into or something, that we can let them do that.
No, that's great. So 1:30 we reconvene here.
Okay.
See you, everyone. Have a good lunch.
Yeah, awesome. Terrific.